Thank you very much for meeting me today.
Pleasure.
Can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Michael Rubinoff. Currently, I'm the Producing Artistic Director of the Canadian Music Theatre Project at Sheridan College and the producer of Theatre Sheridan. And in terms of Come From Away, I'm one of the producers of the project and the creative consultant for the productions. And Come From Away started because I had an idea that the events in Gander and the surrounding towns on 9/11 in the days following should be turned into a musical, or that story should be musicalized.
How did you pitch this musical?
Well, you know, it's very interesting because I had, originally I was a lawyer and a producer looking at developing new musicals, and I'm not a writer myself. I consider myself a creative producer, and in reading the stories, of course, when 9/11 happened, as often happens with world events, Canada finds its connection and relationship to these stories. And one of our connections, of course, was taking in the planes that were coming into the U.S. as U.S. airspace was closed. So the stories that were happening in Gander, Newfoundland, and Labrador were being reported on. And it just spoke to my heart, spoke to me as a Canadian. And I always knew, although I'd never visited Newfoundland and Labrador, I'd always known that music was a huge part of their DNA. It's in their DNA. It's how they tell stories. So I started to believe that this was a compelling story, and the compelling reason to musicalize it was because of the importance of music to the culture. So when I first thought about this, and research stories, and I'd listened to a lot of Great Big Sea music as I was researching those stories. When I went out and pitched it to people, I needed to find writers. As I said, I'm not a writer. And I pitched it as is. I mean, this was just a story. I thought it was important that I think that musical theater and theater in general is a chronicle of history. One of the things that I was concerned about was many writers live in New York, or American writers, a lot of playwrights, composers, lyricists. New York is the center of theater, and there was a hesitancy, of course, to write about what happened on 9/11. And I, again, believe that art is part of the chronicle of history, and that here was a story that was showing the best of humanity against the backdrop of these tragic events. So I tried to pitch it in that sense, that I believed in telling this story about humanity was what the focus was, and not specifically the tragic event itself. But people automatically, of course, rationalized this or saw this as a 9/11 musical, and that there was an issue of that being not appropriate, not in good taste, and a very bad idea. I went to a number of writers and was turned down by them because they just didn't see that as a viable option as a musical. Despite my belief in the story that I thought should be told about these events and how it's centered on, Gander, the towns, and welcoming people from around the world. What was so extraordinary, of course, was here was a town of 9,000 people having 7,000 people show up, and just an incredible display of kindness. One thing that, Canadians, our patriotism is a little more in check. Americans are very good and very proud to display and show their patriotism. I think Canadians are very proud to be Canadians. But our patriotism, we usually see it, in a gold medal hockey game at the Olympics, when the Canadian flags come out and we're screaming and yelling how proud we are to be Canadians. Well, seeing what happened in Newfoundland during that time, it made me so proud to be a Canadian. That always stayed with me, that the values those people exhibited were Canadian values, and I was proud to be, a Canadian, or classified as a Canadian alongside those people. There was this immense feeling of pride. So the story never left me. It always got me emotional every time I read about it, every time I thought about it, and layering on music just heightened that. So unfortunately, for many years, people didn't agree. But I think I'm happy they all disagreed.
And when did you first thought about it?
Right after the events, as I began to read more and more about the stories following 9/11, and again being completely moved by just reading about it. Every article I would read about it would move me. Years later, I think it was a few years on after that, The Day the World Came to Town was released, which also was a very compelling chronicle of what had happened. And so that continued to move me, and of course it became a semi-tradition that the U.S. ambassador to Canada at times would make a choice to go to Gander to commemorate the day. So I had always seen it as a musical quite early on, or that this story was could be something. I use the word compelling because we live in a world now today, when we're doing this interview, where we have 4 companies of the show and a 5th in rehearsal in Australia, and I still can't believe it. I think it'll take me. It's still taking a lot of time to process what has happened on this journey, and time sometimes has an effect on your memories, but what I try to anchor myself in is, let's remember, this was not something that we were, or I was thinking about, that was going to go to Broadway and have a national tour and a Canadian company and open in the West End and win Olivier's. And I never thought about that. I had certainly dreams of my own. I've always had a dream of launching a musical to Broadway. That is a dream of mine. However, in that dream, I never saw a musical about Gander, Newfoundland in the days following 9/11. That was not something that I processed. So it was in terms of how I thought about it, or when I came up that, or this idea that it could be a musical. It was early on. It was just building, it was continuing to build the confidence and the resolve that, as I was continued to be turned down, was to keep trying and trying to connect with people that might be good to take on the project. And if I got another no, you sort of put it away for a few years and come back to it and find, the next group of people, which obviously happened.
So you were still a lawyer back then, right?
I was still a lawyer, so I was practicing law, and parallel to my law career, I was producing theater. So that was producing, I used to say, off-Broadway, mid-sized type theater, commercial theater in Toronto, and doing some development of new musicals, both here, and had a musical at the 2nd New York Musical Theater Festival, a Canadian musical. So I had this really busy, conflicting life of practicing law and producing.
I read that you had approximately 3 months between your articling and the bar exam when you produced a course line.
Yeah, that was my first. So it sort of goes back to my last year of law school. I was very lucky that I had an articling position lined up, so I could take some liberties with my academic coursework and my time, that I decided to put on the university musical at the University of Western Ontario, or now known as Western University, which was Blood Brothers. And that, I always had an interest in theater, but doing that Blood Brothers project, it just really reinvigorated me. And so when I wrote, what had happened is I had articled, and I think it was in between the time I'd finished my articles, I had some time before I had to start real life as an associate, and I decided that I would put on a production of Chorus Line that was, a little bit, it made more sense to Chorus Line because you had less of a set and elements, and it was semi-pro, in the sense that it wasn't equity actors, but these were some recent graduates of theater schools. They would get paid or shared in our profits, but I do remember everybody did get paid, and I would just take a shot at, could we do this? And that show, it ran about a week or a week and a half, was very successful financially. I think artistically there was a lot to learn. I also thought, because I was very cheap, that I could just be a director. I was not a very good director at that time, as the critics eventually let me know. But I would direct and produce when I started out in my career.
How did you manage to make time for all this?
It was really hard. I have to say, it was really hard. It was really hard, and there was a gap of 2 years where I left law, or I left a large law firm. I'd still practiced a little bit of law, but I devoted 2 full years to producing, which had its ups and downs. Toronto went through a lot of change. We had something called SARS, the disease SARS, had come to the city, and it had a huge impact on tourism. The second thing that had an impact at tourism, I started producing in the summer of 2002. Second thing that had an impact was the requirement that you needed passports. As a result of 9/11, you needed passports to cross the border, and a very large number of Americans don't have passports. And we saw the American tourism dry up at the time. So there were challenges. There were many challenges of beginning to produce at that time because of those things. Tried it for 2 years. It was very challenging to make a full-time go at it. Went back to practice law. I was very lucky that, you know, my backup plan was that I'd have to practice law with my father, who's a lawyer, and you know, luckily that's what happened, I guess. And I think I had although I worked really hard, but I had a little bit more leeway of dabbling in theater and practicing law through those years when you're working for your dad. I don't know if he was happy about that, but I was able to well, part of the problem was too, I sort of said I'm not going to produce again, but all these wonderful opportunities and compelling scripts and kept coming my way because I was known as the guy that was doing this off-Broadway work and getting calls from New York saying, do you want to launch the Canadian production of this? And so I just kept taking some of those on.
And how did you learn what to do, like how to do it?
You know what, I met with a lot of producers when I started my career. You know, in Toronto, West End, Broadway. I did the 14-week intensive on commercial producing through the Commercial Theatre Institute, CTI, which was really, really helpful. But everybody I met sort of concluded with the same thing. You just got to do it. You have to do it, and that's how you learn. And I was lucky to be able to afford to do it. So a lot of the time, you know, I broke the golden rule of producing. I was putting my own money into the shows. Eventually I cultivated investors, and you learn. And quite frankly, I'm still learning. That's the beauty of it. I think it's an incredibly complex business that is very much affected by what is happening in culture and politics and so many factors of what's going on in the world that I think you have to continuously adjust. And certainly as someone that started producing in 2002, you know, you would take out ads in the major newspapers and you'd sell tickets. Well, that model has completely shifted, you know, obviously with online, you know, marketing. I remember being the first producer in Canada to use Groupon. I put a show on Groupon. No one had ever done that before. And now you think back, and that seems like Groupon. You know, we're way past Groupon on to Today Tix and other, you know, platforms. So I think you continue to learn as a producer, and you need to be open to evolving and changing with the climate and the business in order to succeed. But I think what hasn't changed is, and what a producer has is, identifying what may be a compelling story to a large group of people. And I think you need to try and find that. And if I can share one story, the one producer in the world that I wanted to meet, who I wrote a letter to after my articles, was Cameron McIntosh, and said I was coming to London, would he agree to meet? I'd love to talk about commercial producing. And he was very gracious. in saying yes. And I went to meet with him, and I walked into his gorgeous office, and he said, "So you want to produce commercial theater? 2 things: trust your own taste and common sense." And I've lived by those, because all you have as a producer is the trust in your own taste and common sense, in the sense that it's only what do I think might resonate with an audience, and then how do you build a team and gather support for that. And on an early level, I obviously believed in this story that Come From Away depicts. As you know, an incredible village of people, town of people, have come along since I've started to put it on the path to success that it is. I feel very privileged and fortunate to have, sparked the moment and started it and put that effort into the early development of working with David and Irene, and what could this be?
Tell me about your first meeting with David and Irene. I know you saw their musical.
Sure, yeah. So, of course, My Mother's Lesbian Jewish Wiccan Wedding was a really big deal in Canadian musical theatre, because it was at the Fringe Festival in, a very tiny theatre. Rubinoff Productions, Canada's commercial theatre producer, picked it up, put it in a 700-seat theatre. At that time, it was called the Panasonic Theatre. And I was pretty late to that party. I didn't see it at the Fringe. I didn't realize what the fuss was all about, and wasn't too interested in going to see it. However, I had a show following My Mother's Lesbian Jewish Wiccan Wedding in that same theatre, called Love, Loss, and What I Wore, which was an Off-Broadway show, and I was doing the Canadian premiere of it. And I was offered comps to see the show, and I thought, well, I should get a better idea of the theater and go see it, with very little expectation. And I remember 10 minutes into the show, tapping my friend that I was with, saying, "Oh my gosh, this is really good." And I was so moved by it. It was authentic, it was truthful, it was entertaining. David Hine played himself and was very charming. Irene was in the cast, and right away I got home that night. I'd never met them. I don't think I'd ever been in a room with them. And I wrote them, and I said, and David had given, I remember this, David gave a speech about supporting Canadian music theatre at the curtain call. So that spoke to everything I believed in. I was like, oh my gosh, we got to know each other. We're all speaking from the same book. So I had written a Facebook message. I had found David on Facebook and said, addressed it to Dave and Irene. I say, I'm so late to this wedding, but this is amazing. I was moved by it. I talked about the authenticity, the truth of it, and I said, we need to know each other. It's so ironic, right? I was really like, I want to know what you're doing next. Like, what's your next project? And we agreed that we would go for dinner, and so I think it may have been a month later or so, the three of us went out for dinner, and we hit it off. I mean, it was just I think there was just a kinship right away, that we believed in musical theatre, we believed in Canadian musical theatre, we believed in good storytelling. It was interesting to hear about their history in terms of their education and their work, and David is a singer-songwriter, and just their journey of being married in New York in the months after 9/11, and being there, and it was just a wonderful conversation, and if nothing, it was just like, oh my gosh, here's some new friends, and it's amazing what they've accomplished with My Mother's Lesbian Jewish Wiccan Wedding. But for some reason, and I remember the dinner. I remember the dinner really well. But for some reason, what I can't recall is why. But at the end of it, I said to them, "Hey, I've been trying to find people to write this musical about the events in Gander, Newfoundland on 9/11 and the days following." And I remember David really being, saying, "Oh yeah, no, I love Newfoundland music. I'm totally into that. It's totally." They're like, "Yeah, we'll look into that." And that really was, the start of what Come From Away is, because they had an enthusiasm, and I can't recall specifically what happened next, except to say a few months after that meeting, I was being interviewed to come to Sheridan as the Associate Dean of Visual and Performing Arts. And I'd sort of known for a while, but whatever, took a while for the interview to happen in the fall of 2010. And one of my strategic objectives, if I was going to come to the school, was to start an incubator to develop new musicals called the Canadian Music Theatre Project, because a 3-year diploma program was transitioning to a 4-year honors bachelor's degree, and we needed a capstone project. And I thought this was a great opportunity to do something that we needed in Canada, was a stable incubator. And doing it through an academic institution, we could stabilize the funding and bring guest artists to work with our students to develop these shows. So I guess as that was happening, I had promised David and Irene, but the first show that I would develop was Come From Away. Now, Come From Away had several different titles before. Come From Away, I think we had originally called it Gander. In the application that I had written, or the letter of support I had written in their application for the Canada Council for the Arts, I used the title 5 Days in Gander. You know, I came to Sheridan January 3rd, 2011, and they were making plans to go to Gander for their research trip on, obviously, September 2011, and that this was programmed for the end of our season in 2012, in April of 2012. And, you know, my objective was, you know, we gave them some money to write. We found a director and a musical director. They would have 5 weeks to rehearse, and then we'd do a books and stands presentation, or 5 weeks to develop. The only obligation was just process. Not worry about production, we'll just do 45 minutes. And I'll just go back. I remember they went off to Gander. We would talk every few days, and it was unbelievable because it was like, yeah, we just moved out of our hotel. Someone gave us their house and said, just feed the cats. And it just all this hospitality that we now know so well was unfolding for them. Or we would have calls like, we're meeting Beverly Bass today. And of course, these people in our worlds, like between the three of us, they were rock stars. I mean, you know, they'd be like, oh, we're meeting Claude, or we met Oz today. And we were just like, oh my gosh, this is so exciting, because they had done a lot of research before. And, you know, so we knew of these people. We didn't know who they were, but we knew of these people. So it was very, very exciting to hear all their stories. And then they came back with stacks of notes and tapes and all of this research that they had done. Because I think they ended up staying a little longer, close to a month. They were only going to stay 3 weeks, but they didn't have to pay for hotels. They could extend the trip. I was worried they weren't going to come back. And the objective was just do 45 minutes. Back to the title, though. What they did say, come back, and of course there's a million brilliant things, of course, that they've done, that to call the show Gander was to exclude the other towns that participated. And that was very smart and very appropriate, because this really was a beautiful effort by all of those towns. And they had heard the term Come From Away certainly when they were there. And I don't know, I can't remember if Come From Away was like the title, but it was the title for that moment in time, and I guess it just stayed. I think everybody was too busy with, you know, everything else that the title didn't get revisited. It became Come From Away, because anything with Gander would have excluded, you know, Appleton, Glenwood, you know, Lewisport, Norris Arm. I'm always like, oh, I want to make sure I get them all. I feel like I've missed one.
Gambo?
Gambo. So, you know, it was important that their involvement was acknowledged, and I love when they're all mentioned in the show. I think that's so important that they are all mentioned in the show.
How many people approximately did they interview?
Oh my gosh, it really probably was in the over 100 people. I mean, they really interviewed anybody they could find. I mean, everyone had come. There were so many people that came back, but they really interviewed as many people as they could, because in the early discussions about what stories were going to be included, there were things that they wrote about and made it into a draft and came out. There were things that made it into a draft and got performed in rehearsal. There were things that made it into a draft, were rehearsed and went into presentations and then came out. So the thing about what happened there was, and I think this is really a credit at the end of the day, and was sort of a nice compliment to hear from the people that saw the Gander concert, was that there were 16,000 stories. And to be honest, I really think they did the best job possible in capturing 16,000 stories. I mean, every moment, and we've met those people, every moment from, the Bible, we started speaking the same language. Those are two people that run a church. Those are actual people. If you take another piece from the story in terms of amalgamations of different stories, Mrs. Noonan, the French teacher, and those teachers at Gander Academy. So, a lot of those stories came into the show in some way or shape or form. David likes to talk about the air traffic controllers making chili, and the air traffic controllers that saw the show were just astounded because that's what they were doing, So, I think they did a great job of I think any other writers could have just been overwhelmed and given up and just been like, we don't know what to do or what to focus on. But they had a plan. They identified the stories that were most compelling, and then were able to craft narrative and bring in other stories to support that narrative. And I sometimes get asked, how many characters are portrayed in Come From Away? I don't know if anybody has any idea. I don't know if anyone's actually done a count with all the switching of characters, how many people actually are represented as a physical number. I know it's well over 100, close to 200. I don't know the exact number, but I think the totality of the piece, I think they really have done a good job of representing the true stories and the spirit of 16,000 people.
What was the timeline like? How long did it take them to write the first song?
So they got back, I guess at the beginning of October. We had auditions with our students at the beginning of December. And for those auditions, I'm not sure if they had songs ready. They may have had a song or two ready. They may have had little scenes. But we do a show in our studio theater, or one in our studio theater, one on our main stage. We were doing Sweeney Todd on our main stage. So the students getting called back for Sweeney Todd were very happy, and then students getting called back from this thing Come From Away were like, what the heck is this? What is Rubinoff doing? We want to be in Sweeney Todd. I mean, this is Sweeney Todd. Who doesn't want to be in their final year or in the music theater program and do Sweeney Todd? Versus what? I was only doing a 45-minute workshops at Books and Stands. We weren't doing a production. So this was the last production slot of the year. There was a group of students who were going to be graduating. Come From Away was going to be their final show. So when the cast list went up, there were a lot of disappointed students to be cast in Come From Away. I can tell you that, because we just didn't know. So they certainly, the first songs that they wrote were really between October, December, into January and February. We probably would have started rehearsal the last week of February, the first week of March. I do have a vivid memory. My practice is, to welcome everybody on the first day of rehearsal when we do the new musicals, get out of the room, let them work, come in on Friday, because we start Monday, come in on Friday and let's see what they have. I will absolutely never forget coming into that room on Friday and having the cast perform for me, at that time, what was called Welcome to Newfoundland. You knew that was special. I get emotional because it wasn't like, oh, that's going to Broadway. This is like, but boy, had they captured the spirit of what that province was and what the day was like and setting up the community and, the Welcome to the Rock, and it was so powerful. So I remember just being floored hearing that for the first time and really excited. And again, only 45 minutes, so I believe, which is most of those songs are still in the show some way, shape, or form, that you really had Welcome to Newfoundland become Welcome to the Rock. You had Blankets and Bedding, you had 28 Hours, you had Screechin', and you had, at the time, I remember we did the whole presentation, it ended with Screechin', and David played guitar for it. And then I think David or one of the cast members said, maybe it was David that came up and said, yeah, we have another song, we're not sure where it's going to go in the show, but we're going to do it for you anyways. And that 45-minute presentation would end with Costume Party, which was really beautiful. I remember the students singing it on in the last performance, and it was quite moving just as they're graduating. I don't know, Costume Party just really resonated. But it was just like, here's this song, Costume Party, we don't know where it belongs. So in those 45 minutes, that was kind of the first sequence of material that was shared with an audience. And we did it, we didn't even do it in our studio theater. I did it in one of our dance studios because I wanted to lower the expectations of our audiences. I thought people would be mad at me for doing this. So we didn't think anyone would show up. So I did the very first 45-minute presentation of Come From Away, I did at that Panasonic Theatre in downtown Toronto, because I felt I wanted to create buzz, and I thought, I could create a buzz, and then people would say, you should come out to Sheridan, which is in Oakville, which is 40 minutes outside of Toronto, and see 12 presentations or 10 presentations. So I did it in Toronto first, and then I put out like 30 chairs in our dance studio. The next night, I had to put out 50 chairs. The next night, I had to put out 70 chairs. And then we were full. I mean, word had gotten out that this was just a very emotional, powerful thing. Whatever it was, people were crying. I mean, it was just very moving. And the essence of it was captured in those first 45 minutes. And one of the stories I like to tell is Amir Hayder, who's a standby in the Toronto production. Amir was Sweeney Todd. So Amir was in the class that was part of Come From Away, but he was cast as Sweeney, so he got the prime role. And a bunch of his peers were in Sweeney, and then a number of his peers were in Come From Away. And Amir, we do a run of the show for the Sweeney Todd cast. And I remember when he came, he was inconsolable. Amir's from Beirut, from Lebanon. This was his adopted home. This was just a beautiful story about his adopted home, and he was inconsolable. And I do remember him going to David and Irene and saying, this is going to go somewhere, and if you ever need anyone to play a tree, I would love to just play a tree. Well, when Amir went on, I saw Amir go on for his first time as Kevin J. And as soon as I heard because I know, I just know their voices so well. And as soon as I heard him sing his first lines in the opening number, I don't think I stopped crying. I just thought it was a real full circle moment, that from our dance studio here to the stage of the Royal Alex at the time, here was one of my students that had made it into Come From Away. So it was really powerful to see him in the show. So he got to be a part of it. And what happened was, knowing it was powerful, I had said to David and Irene, I said, let's keep going. I'll commit to putting it in our season. We'll do it in our season next year. Maybe it'll just be an extended reading. Maybe it'll be a production. But more money to keep writing, more support. Just keep going. Let's keep doing this. And it wasn't something we did here. We didn't really do that. But this was, again, it was something special. I don't think any of us knew. By special, I thought maybe a Canadian theatre would pick it up. Nobody was interested in it after the first 45-minute presentation. no Canadian theatres were interested. We had people see it, nobody wanted to take it. It was really kind of disheartening because the story, nobody was interested. After we brought it back, so then we brought it back and it went into rehearsal in January. And then we ended up doing a production of it, a 2-act, production of it, because it was just farther along. Then everybody was really into it. We had a lot of people that were interested in doing the show, but a number of things had been happening. When we started rehearsal here, there was an opportunity to be part of the Goodspeed's Festival of New Musicals with students from the Hart School and the University of Hartford. And I remember in the fall, David and Irene had called me and said, Donald Hilton, who I just think is a legendary producer, nurturer of new writers, emerging writers. I think there's probably not a single Broadway writer that has a show on Broadway right now that hasn't been nurtured by Donald Lynn. But David and Irene called me and said, hey, Goodspeed is interested in putting it in the festival, but we just want to check in with you because it's at the same time we start rehearsals, so we just want to make sure we have to tell them no. And I was just like, excuse me, what? Is it Goodspeed's interested? Are you kidding me? We will make this work. I will do whatever I need to do to make this work because Goodspeed is a very important theater. It's a very important theater to launching musicals and being a great home for musicals, new musicals. And it was a great opportunity to have those students in East Hampton, Connecticut, and our students here interact. We did a Skype session between the two groups where they said hello. They each sang from the show for each other. And then I got to go out there. And one of the special things was they do the whole show at Books and Stands. So that was the longest version of Come From Away ever to be performed by the public because they had made a number of changes when they came back from Goodspeed, because the presentation was on a Saturday or Sunday, and then Monday they were back in rehearsal with us. The students had been learning music, and there had been a number of cuts that were made from Goodspeed. But what was really significant about that was it was the first time the show was ever going to be performed in the United States to an American audience. And I think there was a lot of concern as to whether or how would Americans react to this. Of course, the show's very funny. Has a great deal of humor. Would that humor resonate because of the backdrop of the subject matter? And we were worried. I think David and Irene were very worried. I was trying to be the positive front, even though I was really nervous. And it was so special. That is also a moment, a defining moment in the process, because we saw a sold-out American audience embrace the show and laughed and cried. And when they started singing in Somewhere Home America, Home in America, I thought the roof was going to come off the theater. It was just so powerful. And I think that was a moment where we knew, okay, this could be something bigger than Canada, that there could be an audience outside of Canada for the show.
And how did the musical evolve over the time from the first workshop and?
Well, I think there are a couple of big leaps. I mean, I think obviously going through the first 45 minutes was really just seeing if there was anything there. Then going to, a 2-act, expanding it, trying to find the frame of the story and the tone. I really still believe the guts, the heart, the spirit of the show was developed, it was worked on and developed here at Sheridan. It then got, one of the things was up until the NAMP presentation too, show had never been done with age-appropriate actors. Not that we knew. I remember we would have discussions being like, how old is this character? How old should this character be? We really had no concept because you just had young people, and I feel the frenetic energy in the show has stayed in there. Why does the show move the way that it does? And this show was created with 20-year-olds who had this incredible energy in terms of the pace of music and the way it moves. So when it got to NAMPT, it was the first time that 45 minutes were done with adult actors. Again, not sure if they were age appropriate or if those would be the ages that would eventually, that the actors would be those ages. as we've seen, a beautiful thing is that everybody's of different ages. You know, there's a whole range of ages within companies and across companies, which is a beautiful thing. So that NAMT opportunity was very obviously informative. And then as the team came on, the professional, you know, Broadway team, or the Broadway team began to be assembled, then you saw so much begin to change in the sense of when you're bringing in orchestration, and you're bringing in the arrangements, and you're deciding to go from a 2-act structure to a 1-act structure, you know, which obviously changes things quite drastically, because, you know, the show was running just over 2 hours, and you certainly couldn't have a 2-hour 1-act. It'd be quite lengthy. And sort of how did Chris Ashley and Kelly Devine and Ian Eisendrath come on board to begin to shape, you know, what the production would become now. And then the designers, so aesthetically, what would it look like? I mean, I remember sort of being kept out of, you know, rehearsals, or Dave and Irene would share very little with me about La Jolla, because it was an opportunity for me to see it like the person that had known, one of the, outside of Dave and Irene, who had known the show the best, to see it with fresh eyes, like just for it to hit me at La Jolla. And of course, so many members of those casts are like Broadway heroes of mine, like just, you know, it was very exciting. And I'll never forget seeing it in La Jolla for the first time cold on opening night, and being like, oh my gosh, the show's been Broadwayfied. Like, it was so exciting. And I remember going back the next night, I had missed 80% of it because I was just so emotionally caught up. Like, I just didn't even realize what had changed, what hadn't changed, you know, that the props people had put shoppers on the baskets. I mean, it was just so many revelations. But the first time, it was just full of emotion. Beverly Bass and Tom were sitting behind me. It was the first time they had ever seen the show. So it certainly evolved, and it continued to evolve. I think one of the most beautiful things is Kelly Devine's work, you know, in terms of finding this beautiful, subtle, impactful, powerful movement and choreography for people that are not dancers. That to me had one of the most exciting journeys of the artistic and creative work was really her development of that, because I think it's stunning, and every piece of it advances plot and advances story in such a organic and an integral way. And certainly the orchestration. I mean, I think August Eric Smoen's orchestration and Ian's contributions as an arranger is stunning. I mean, it's amazing, you know, what happens when it goes to that level, and how it tells story and enhances story. I mean, Beowulf Borat's set, which is, again, the most complex simplicity you can put on a stage in terms of what is being said by that set, what is on that set, how that set is used. And then you layer on Howell Binkley's exquisite and extraordinary lighting, and it heightens everything. And again, it's what Howell is so good at, being able to tell a story. So all of these elements, same with Tony, that you know, it's this idea of how do you play 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different characters with very subtle costume changes. So the evolution and discovery that all those elements brought to the show under Chris Ashley's, you know, Tony Award-winning direction, just raised and heightened the storytelling and the work that David and Irene did and continue to do. And I think because it had a robust development period here, and also through Fifth Avenue and Seattle Rep, because there was this robust development and good speed, you could really start to dive into specificity, so that your plot, your storytelling was there. How do you dive down and make those almost surgical improvements to story that serve the piece. And I think the team got to do that and contribute to something so great. I also think Sue and Randy and Kenny and Marlene's producing strategy of taking the show to La Jolla, Seattle Rep, to Ford's Theatre, to Toronto's Mirvish Theatre, Gander, before Broadway, made a huge difference, because I think everyone got to learn about the show, improve the show, how to tell people about the show, and it built up a group of loyal supporters that when people in New York were fearful for all the right reasons of wanting to go see it, you had quite a mass of people saying, please see it. It's healing. It's not what you think it's going to be. It's funny. It has humor. It respectfully honors the people that lost their lives. That path was very important, I think, to the success that the show enjoys.
And how do you choose where to take the show? For example, why La Jolla and not some other theater?
So, my understanding is, of course, Chris Ashley's the artistic director there, so that's his artistic home. And certainly the La Jolla Playhouse is one of the leading regional theaters in the world for launching new musicals or launching musicals to Broadway. They have an incredible audience that embraces new work and encourages new work. Seattle Rep, is home to, Seattle certainly being home to Kenny and Marlene and Ian, and so many supporters of the show and of the work. So, and there was an early workshop that was done there, so I think it made sense to go there. Ford's Theatre, I think, was important to share the story with a community that was directly impacted by the events. That was very moving. The first time the show was ever played on 9/11 was in Washington, D.C., and it was very moving. It was I remember taking a taxi from my hotel and going past the Pentagon to the theater, and it was very powerful, the impact the show had that day. I think the greatest part of the journey, I know for me and for many of us, was the concert in Gander. Being able to bring the entire company and group and everybody that had been working so hard on the show to Gander, to do it in the hockey arena for the community, was magical and scary. How would they react? How would they take this? Would it be embraced? Would they be offended? Did we get this right? Did we get that right? It was nothing but love and warmth and excitement and getting their blessing, which was important. And if you think back then, there wasn't a cast recording. There were some rave reviews, but Broadway hadn't happened. There weren't any fancy award nominations. I mean, this was still a show, very much on a journey. But that energy and emotion in Gander is something I will never forget. I remember the next day, it was Sue Frost's birthday, and going out to look for a birthday cake for her. And what should have taken 10, 15 minutes took about 3 hours, because anywhere you went in town, people stopped you to express how much they loved it and what they liked specifically, and they felt they were reflected in the story, or they knew so-and-so who was a character in the story. So that was really, those days were just amazing. And then coming home to Toronto for me was, here's where it began, and to be in the theater that sparked my interest in the theater was seeing the Canadian Company of Les Miserables when I was 13. That was a dream come true. And then on the way to Broadway, which is the biggest dream of them all, but still not sure how this was going to be received.
Tell me more about Gander. What was it like to meet, Oz Fudge and others for the first time?
So I went out to Gander. I'd never been to Newfoundland until after our first workshop. So after our first workshop, I went to visit Gander that summer and St. John's. And I had made meetings with Oz, Claude, Bonnie, Beulah, for sure. And it was like, I don't know, people you had kind of lived with in your mind and your thoughts for so long, to meet them. I mean, I remember waiting outside the Legion for Beulah, and she gets out of her pickup truck, and I hold out my hand to shake her hand, and the first thing she says to me, she looks at me and she says, "I don't do handshakes, I only do hugs." Oh, my heart melted. I thought, oh, this is going to be something. You know? Just that I was like, you know, you sort of sometimes think, is this for real? Are these people really like this? And they were awesome. And Claude and Oz I met at the town hall, and I don't think they knew what the heck we were doing. I mean, you know, I love the story about, and I've had lots of chats with Reg Wright, the CEO of the airport, you know, said to David and Irene, "Oh, good luck, you know, making a show about making sandwiches. Like, that'll go great." I don't think they really understood what we were doing at that, especially at that time. I mean, I had a demo recording of songs that I gave them. I don't think they really understood that. But they were generous in their time and in sharing the story and what had happened. But again, I don't think they knew just don't think they knew what we were doing. I don't think it crystallized. I got to see the show. The Canadian Consulate hosted a Canada Night at Seattle Rep, and it was the first time Claude was coming to see the show. Claude had been invited down. Claude had never seen it, and I was very fortunate to get to go. And it was really powerful. Watching him watch the show. He did a Q&A after. I remember Skyping or FaceTiming in David and Irene, because we were really excited about what would he think. Because I think he was the first local to see the show in its incarnation. When we did it here at Sheridan, when we did the production in our studio theater, Kevin Turf came to see it, and Janice Gowdy came to see it. And that was like, I don't think they knew what they were in for either. They're like, oh, we're going to some college to see some production about, you know, for Kevin, like being stranded in Newfoundland. Okay, we'll see what this is like. Totally overcome with emotion. Janice came the next day. She cried through the whole thing. I remember watching her and just weeping, and both of them said that, which was so wonderful, that to David and Irene, that this is what happened. Like, this completely captures what happened. So when Claude saw it, that was really exciting. And then Claude and I we were flying back to Toronto, because he had to fly to Toronto to get back home via Toronto. And that's where we kind of hatched the idea about, or, you know, could we really pull off this concert in Gander? So that kind of was the bit of the genesis of that coming together. I mean, they wanted to do it, but it was like, could we do this? How could we do this? Were they on board? How would this work? But so it was very special to be with him to see it. But again, I don't think any of them knew. I remember Nick and Diane came to NAMT, the 45-minute presentation at NAMT, and sitting beside them and them holding hands and squeezing each other. I mean, again, I had lived with these people and their story, like not physically, but had lived in my mind, and to be sitting beside them and like feeling their love and their bond and their memories and their emotion was really powerful stuff, you know. So most of the people, I think most of them didn't, most of the locals didn't see the show. I think all of them, except for Claude, didn't see it till it was in concert in Gander. That was their first introduction to seeing it. You know, the Come From Aways, many of them had seen it between the La Jolla Playhouse and Seattle Repertory Theater. And these people have become a family, you know. They're not just characters in a show for us. We are invested in their highs and their lows, and I think we've all had our highs and lows, as life is on this journey. But we just love, it's just pure love for each other, and we're very lucky that as these productions open and special events happen, we call them family reunions. They're family reunions, you know. You get to see everyone in person and catch up and see how everyone's doing. And I think for me, I always set out with the importance of wanting to share their story with the world. I thought people should know what they did, because it's pretty amazing, even though it's taken them a long time to believe that what they did was amazing. Some of them will accept that. A lot of them still don't. But the fact that their story is being shared with the world and doing so much good is really surreal, but also the most satisfying thing that I just wanted people to know the story, because I knew the vast majority of the world would have no idea, A, where Newfoundland is, never mind Gander, or just how extraordinary it was, what they did.
How did your family react when all this happened?
You know, it's interesting. I think the best part of the journey, I keep saying, is being able to share this with my parents. You know, my parents are well, they're healthy. They've been seeing it through the start. They've heard me talk about it for years and years and years. I think as Canadians, you know, we observe all this wonderful stuff that happens in the United States, whether it be Academy Awards, Tonys, Broadway. So to be a small part of it, and for them to be able to enjoy it. My mom has come to a number of openings with me. Both my parents came to the Broadway opening and to the Tony Awards. It's a really beautiful thing. I think as you get older and as your parents get older, when you can, your parents always provide for you, and in many cases, if they have the means. I've been very lucky to have had a wonderful childhood and have been supported by my parents throughout life. To be able to do something really special for them, or to share these special experiences with them, has been really wonderful. My mom came to Gander for the concert, which was thrilling, and my mom is she's I think she's better friends with all these people than I am. As you know, I travel a lot, and they're all like, you know, worried and concerned, and they express that to my mom, and they express that to me, you know, why are you going here? Why aren't you at home? What are you doing there? Better be careful, better watch out. So I feel like my parents are part of that bigger family, for sure.
By the way, how frequently do you travel?
I travel a lot. I feel very fortunate that because of the work that we've done, and the doors certainly that Come From Way has opened, it's just expanded the reach of where we can develop musical theater and where our shows are being produced all around the world. Whether it's Come From Way or a number of shows, we've developed now over 25 shows. This year, 5 of those shows will have their world premieres at theaters in the US and Canada. I'm doing a lot of work in China developing new musicals. So it sort of takes you to all these different places, and it's really exciting because the world's a big place, but it's astonishing when I'm in China and I go meet with, you know, I'm also engaged in arts education. You go to a post-secondary education institution, and you visit a music theater program, which they do have music theater performance programs, and I'm introduced in Mandarin, and it's usually mentioned my connection to Come From Away, and 1 or 2 of the students will start singing a song from the show, and I'm floored. And there is a big fan base and following of young people in China that love the show. So it's also been fun, whether they have productions in that area or not, but that the show has found its way and resonated with people all over the world, and many of those people, or a number of those people, have traveled to places where the show is to see it.
Speaking of China, how did you decide to make this musical about Doctor? I'm not sure how to pronounce
Norman
his name.
Bethune.
Yeah.
Well, Norman Bethune is another great story. I'm very invested in stories about Canada, not exclusively, but Canada has a short but very interesting history. So I believe those stories should be shared with the world. Norman Bethune is probably the most famous Canadian that Canadians don't know of. Norman Bethune was a doctor, and in the late 30s, he went to practice medicine on the front lines of Mao's army. And he's credited with bringing modern medicine to China and bringing medicine to the front lines to help save the lives of soldiers. He's created medical instruments that are still used today in surgeries everywhere. And unfortunately, he died of blood poisoning, the results of an operation. and Mao gave a eulogy to him. And that eulogy at one point in China, as a kid, as a student, you had to memorize that eulogy. I believe now he's just taught as part of the curriculum. I mean, he was one of the early Western faces of communism. There's a lot of he's a fascinating man. I mean, in China, he's revered as a saint. He certainly had his pros and cons. He was a human being. I mean, he was not perfect. I mean, he was certainly flawed. So, you know, there's over 1 billion people on the planet who know who this man is, but very few Canadians do. And I believe that this would be an interesting subject matter for a musical, because it's a very, again, a compelling story. It is extraordinary what he did in his life, whether you believe in communism or not. That's not what it's about. You know, music is a way sometimes to bridge language. So that's why I believe it could be a great musical, because we use music to convey certain emotion or sentiments, whether that's being spoken to us or sung to us in Mandarin or English. So it's in development. We just did another workshop of it last week. I think we've gotten a good idea now of the tone of the show and what we want it to feel like, because we don't want it to be some boring historical drama. And we're going to continue to develop it and work on it, and hopefully it will get a professional premiere in the near future.
Fingers crossed.
Yes.
What's your definition of success?
Oh boy, that's changed.
What was it like and what was it now?
Well, listen, I always wanted to, you know, launch a musical to Broadway and be part of you know, creating something original that would resonate in the musical theater. I feel like I've done that, you know, in the sense that, you know, I mean, Come From Away wouldn't exist if I didn't have the idea and the belief, the determination to pursue the idea and to find people to write it. It's certainly gone on, and like I said earlier, it's had, you know, an incredible group of people that have taken it all the way, and I just feel very lucky to, you know, just be present and to celebrate it. So to me, that was the definition of success. But, you know, I say quite candidly, life is life, you know. You always have the highest highs, and with the highest highs sometimes come the lowest lows. You need to navigate all of this. It's quite challenging. When I look at it now, and I'm on the other side of the Come From Away journey in many respects, success to me, you know, I sort of have two roles. I have the incredible opportunity to work with young people. Most of those young people are Canadians who wish to pursue a career in the musical theater. And success is providing them with the best education and opportunities to make it easier for them to get work in the professional world. And I'm really proud of our graduates and the number of them that not only work, but create. The Canadian Music Theatre Project has sparked an excitement in writing, and more of them are writing their own work and developing their own work, using their tools to create. So I think that's the success in my academic life. The flip side of that, the other side of that success, which I think is married to part of that, I'm fiercely committed to Canada. I just believe in this country. I believe in its talent. I believe our theater practitioners, our writers, are just as good as anybody else in the world. I think we have good stories to tell. We just have to work harder to tell them, or to find them and to support them in the development, and then to tell them. So I think success for me now looks like, as I begin to rationalize some of this, is how do you support a Canadian industry? And how do you support something where Canadian theaters are doing new Canadian musicals? And we're seeing that slowly, but we are seeing that, that more and more Canadian theaters, regional theaters, have realized that it's important to invest, develop, and produce Canadian musicals. And we're seeing that probably in the most significant way in this upcoming season. The Seagull Centre in Montreal has been doing that. The Charlottetown Festival has been doing that. We've seen it out in Halifax. We've seen it out at Theatre Calgary. We're seeing it at the Citadel, Edmonton. We're seeing it at the incredible Grand Theatre in London, Ontario. So we're seeing this wave of investment in Canadian writers and composers. And I feel the work that we've been doing has been a part of starting that renaissance. Obviously locally here at home, of course, the other most important theatre is the Musical Stage Company and the work that Mitchell Marcus is doing. And through that investment, I think our writers are getting better and more opportunities that they're springboarding their work around the world, whether that's in the United States or the West End or anywhere. I should go back and say the Neptune Theatre in Halifax. We're seeing Canadians, we're seeing their work produced more and more. And I believe Canadians have a certain view of the world. We observe the Americans because we're so close to them. We observe their culture, so I think we're very good at observing and how that affects art. We see that with the success of Canadian comedians. We see that with the success of Canadian pop musicians. I think we're now seeing that in terms of television, when you look at shows like Schitt's Creek or Kim's Convenience. And I think we're also seeing that in the ecology of theater with regards to things like Come From Away. So it's a very long-winded answer to say, I think this, for me, success looks like, the sort of the fruits of your labor in supporting the industry, supporting the writers, giving them the opportunities to fail, because they need that more than ever, to fail in a safe place, and to just keep investing in them and making sure that our theaters continue to invest in them, because it only brings benefit to Canada. And I'm so glad that I have an example like Come From Away. I mean, when you see what Come From Away says about Canada, or the fact that Come From Away has made a noticeable impact on tourism, which changes lives in Newfoundland and Labrador. I mean, I say to everybody that raves to me about the show, the first thing I like to say is, if you have the means, go visit. Go support. They need your support. They want to see you. They want to take care of you. They want to show you around. So I believe theater can have all these economic benefits, all of these community benefits, social benefits. So to me, that's all part of the success, and in my small way of using art to change the world for the better, just a little bit at a time.
Did you find the courage to switch from law career, like after something like a decade of working there, to being a producer?
I was not happy being a lawyer. You know what? You sort of know where your passion is, and I think I wasn't passionate about the law and what I had to do. I mean, I did a little bit of entertainment law, I did commercial real estate. I just didn't see my future being there. What got me excited was creating, working with great people, and when the opportunity opened up here at Sheridan, which I never imagined. I never imagined I would end up in academia, and not for a second, nor did I ever imagine that it was really academia that fulfilled my dream and has allowed me to do the work that I absolutely love. So I think it was just being unhappy, which is good motivation. But I'll never forget the first day I showed up here, and walking from the parking lot to my new office being like, what did you just do? Did you just make the biggest mistake of your life? And there's no question being in a post-secondary institution has its challenges, but it's really fun to create theater here. And I think the best part of any journey is creation. When you're at the beginning, when you're at the start, when you're sort of really devising what something could be and giving advice to writers and working with them and encouraging them to try new things and encouraging them to keep going or really look at what they're trying to say or what their show is about. And to do that with young people who are committed and eager, want to please, want to use their talent, ready to make choices and take risks. It's a very, very exciting environment to be in, and it just keeps you engaged. You know, I don't get jaded. I always feel that there's new ideas and new creativity being sparked all around me. It's very rare to be in that environment, I've learned.
Any advice for time management?
For
I mean, you're so busy and you're wearing so many hats.
time management. It's very hard. Yeah, it's very hard. As you get older, you get more tired. It's a challenge. I think as you look at time management, I think what I try and do is, and I'm very lucky I have this luxury, is work with the people and on the projects that I want to work on. Something has to really resonate with me. I have to be really passionate about it to commit the effort that needs to be committed to that. Now, not all I don't have to feel that way about all projects that we may develop and work on through the CMTP. I do believe they have to be compelling stories, and it has to be the right people and good people to work on it. But where I focus and spend a lot of my energy, it has to be on projects and people that I'm very, very passionate about, because I do know it is long, it's exhausting, there can be disagreements. It just takes time and patience, full of ups and downs. So I think by focusing on the things that I'm most passionate about, it helps you balance a number of those things.
What do you think is the most common misconception about producing musical theatre in Canada nowadays?
I actually think people don't know what producers do. And I also think the idea of what it means to produce, people don't know what that is. I mean, you know, I do everything, whether it's getting coffee or water or moving chords up to raising money and, you know, working with people in advertising and marketing and, you know, working with writers and reading scripts and giving notes and asking questions. I think in Canada, you know, there sometimes seems to be this very glamorous viewpoint of what a producer is. It just stands there and takes all the glory. There's nothing close to that. It's hard work, and it's having grit and determination and being able to constructively and compassionately talk to people that are very sensitive, and I'll come back to that in 1 second, to bring out their best. Going back to that sensitivity comment, I have tremendous respect for writers and composers who are developing new work. This is stuff that's not fully developed. It is not always their best work. It is not always putting their best foot forward, but they need to do all of that to get to their best work. And they're very vulnerable. And I'm usually the first person in the world that they're sharing that with. And I have tried to have integrity and earn respect. So they don't want to disappoint you. And I appreciate that. And I am just very respectful of their courage in sharing unfinished, in-process work. And I think as a producer, you have to find a constructive and compassionate way to navigate those conversations. And one of the ways I do it is by asking questions, because, and this is the legal training, through a kind cross-examination. It's of no help to say to a writer, I don't like that. That's not good. That doesn't work. That sounds horrible. It's irrelevant. How is a writer going to respond to that? How does that help them find their path or their way? What you want to do is ask a series of specific questions to engage in a discussion to really understand what they are trying to achieve. Because sometimes there's clarity up here, it doesn't always make its way onto the page. And sometimes you just have to help focus them to put that on the page. So sometimes you may have a scene that's just not working. And you say to a writer, and I know it's not working, but I'm not going to say to the writer, that doesn't work. What I'm going to say to the writer is, what are you trying to achieve in this scene? What's the outcome? What do you want to find out? What discovery are we trying to make? And what's really exciting is a writer can then light up and articulate to you and tell you what they want to do. And sometimes the conversation is simply, oh, I love that. That is so exciting. I'm not sure that's on the page, but what you've just said is thrilling. And then they have an epiphany where, oh yeah, okay, I'm not saying that, but I got to go with this. And they run away from you and just start working. And so you balance that. And as a producer in Canada, there's not a lot of us that have spent a lot of time working with writers in that way. And I think writers need that support. And so much in Canada, authors are self-producing. What I try to do is say, I want you to do one thing. I want you to do the one thing you do well, write and compose. Let me worry about whether it's raising money or finding support or what theater it's going to go in, or are people going to show up, how do we market it, how, when David and Irene did, Wicked Wedding, for example, you sort of do it all on your own, right? But how can you really help writers just focus on the one thing that they're good at? They're good at many different things, but I think in this case, what's the one thing they're good at, and support them in doing that work.
Is there anything else you would like to talk about?
The only other thing I'd say, just on reflection, is that's really wonderful. I was a kid that was so impacted by musical theater. It changed my life. It spoke to me in a way that nothing else had spoken to me. And one of the greatest joys about the journey of Come From Away and the other things that we're working on, when I see young people waiting at a stage door, when I see young people writing in Facebook groups, when I see young people doing covers of songs on YouTube, when I see young people graduating from college and their mortarboard is in the theme of Come From Away, when I see people making art, when I see people talking about being so passionate about the show and committing an act of kindness, it's really powerful, because I know how powerful Les Mis affected me, and I know how fortunate that spark was in allowing me to accomplish what I've accomplished. There'd be no Come From Away if there wasn't for Les Mis, and one of the things that Irene and I share dearly is our absolute love and adoration for Les Mis. I think Irene could say the same thing. I don't think Irene would be, the writer she is or have the interest in theater that she has without Les Mis. When I think that there are young people that are going to pursue a career in the theater, whether it's producers, whether it's actors, or even as just theater goers, because Come From Away changed their life, that is just such a beautiful thing and such a powerful thing. And I can't wait for the day, hopefully 20, 30 years, when I'm still at it, and somebody says to me, I got into producing because I saw Come From Away in Toronto or the West End, and it completely changed my life, and I decided, as a teenager, that's what I wanted to do. And that's the beautiful thing about the theater business, and that's what we're so lucky to get to be a part of, and how that story gets told over and over again. And to sort of put an endpoint on this, I had not seen Cameron Mackintosh since that meeting that I had with him in London, which was about 6 days, ironically, before 9/11. Cameron Mackintosh attended the opening of Come From Away in the West End. And I had known some people that knew him very well, and I said, the one thing I would love to accomplish on opening night is to thank Cameron Mackintosh and say hello to him. And this individual and Cameron's husband, Michael, made that happen. And before the show started, I had a few minutes with him, and I told him, I said, I can't imagine you will remember this, but this happened when we met. And you said, if you want to be a commercial producer, common sense and trust your own taste. He just looked at me, he looked around the theater, he looked back at me, and he said, well, now you're a commercial producer. And that was a pretty amazing, powerful, full circle moment that was really, really, really special. Yeah, so that was pretty, that was a pretty amazing thing. So maybe on that note, we'll end.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.